Welcome to another riveting draw with me. Today I'll be drawing Miya from the game Guardian Tales. First pass of the sketch is very rough, literally just to get the concept of the pose down, which I did in a completely separate file dedicated just for sketching, so you don't get to see that. And then I started adding in her features like her hair and her face and stuff. Again, this is very rough, just focusing on proportions and stuff, and especially for the flow of the hair, I'm using Miya's official art as a reference. You can see it up in the right hand corner. Okay, you're not allowed to judge this arm, alright? I had a brain fart and I forgot I can draw for a second, but I rectified it immediately, so. And then on the second pass, I go in and actually make it look like something. And I really use the reference here to get all the details right. So in case you don't know, Clip Studio gives you the ability to add a reference in the corner where the full canvas view usually is, which is a feature I don't usually use but was unbelievably helpful for this drawing. I do sometimes leave the reference zoomed in to an unfortunate place. I think there's about 30 minutes of footage where I'm just fully zoomed in on her boobs. It's artistic, guys, okay? And speaking of her boobs, please don't mind how long I spent trying to get them right. It was a genuine struggle, and they end up getting mostly covered anyway, so shows what I know. This drawing took me 12.5 hours to make, which I think is the longest I've ever spent on a single drawing. And if you watched my last video, you might remember me talking about how I only have a certain amount of time to finish something before I hate it. And this drawing for sure exceeds that limit. To put it into perspective, I usually spend no more than 2 hours on a piece. At the 2-hour mark for this one, I was just getting ready to start lining it. But despite that, it's a piece that I'm happy with and I'm actually really excited to show you guys. I just made the ruffles as a couple squiggly lines and told myself I'd fix them later, which kind of bites me in the butt when later comes around. I want to do something a little bit different this time. I usually talk about whatever comes to mind in my voiceovers, but this time I want to take you through each step and try and explain what I was thinking or feeling while I was drawing. The reason I don't really do that is because I kind of black out whenever I draw, so it's kind of like, your guess is as good as mine as to what I was thinking when I did that, but I will do my best. I pretty much stole the pose from the original game, except I moved her arm that was holding 3 cards because I just didn't feel like they had anything to do with the character, so I just moved it to also be holding the umbrella. I found the game Guardian Tales because I was looking for a Genshin Impact style game. Scrolling through the free Nintendo Switch games, I found it. The perfect game. Genshin Impact and Guardian Tales are extremely similar, at least in all the ways that matter to me. Guardian Tales is level based and not open world like Genshin Impact is, and Guardian Tales is also a pixel game with 2D drawings of the characters in the character profile. As soon as I found Guardian Tales, I became instantly obsessed. I would have dreams about it when I went to sleep, and it was the first thing I thought about when I woke up. It was actually kind of a problem. The majority of the characters actually have 2 different versions of that drawing. The global drawing with, softer shading, and the Japanese version is in this very, classic anime style, which is the one I usually prefer, with, 3 exceptions. For Miya, I pretty much exclusively used her Japanese drawing as a reference, but she's more the exception than the rule, mostly because global Miya kind of freaks me out. But generally, I would take my favorite parts of each version and mush them together. But as I mentioned, I fight in games by smashing buttons, and I cannot for the life of me learn proper strategies. I can either dodge or hit. I cannot do both, alright? Which is why I got stuck at Raiden Shogun in Genshin, because you have to learn her patterns and then hit at the right moments, and I can't. And I also cannot for the life of me get through the 12th world in Guardian Tales. I even went to the internet to ask what heroes I should use and everything. I switched out Miya for Karina because I heard she was a better healer. She is, but that's not the point, and I still can't get through it. And that's literally the only reason my obsession has slowed down is because I got stuck. Quite honestly, I don't want to know how much time I spent trying to draw the ruffles. It was so painful. I overconfidently tried to freehand them at first, and then I downloaded several brushes, none of them meeting my very high ruffle standards, and then I kind of threw in the towel, but still unwilling to admit full defeat, so I decided I'll just trace over the ones that are changing angle, and then freehand the rest. How foolish of me. I very quickly realized there's no way I can do this and just gave up completely, but because I changed the position of the second arm, I couldn't just trace over the ruffles for those, so I decided to just deal with it it later. It was quite literally the last thing I lined because I just did not want to deal with it. But yeah, before Karina, who I'm also planning on drawing by the way, Miya was the healer for my team. And Miya is a gambling exorcist and she gambled away her family's dutiful souls. Gonna be real, I don't know what that means, but I love my gambling addicted Ghostbuster. I haven't met her in the storyline and I'm not sure if she actually ever shows up, but that does mean I don't know all too much about her personality or how she interacts with other characters outside of the list of her voice lines.
紹介いたしました。安らかに眠ってください。これでもっともっと世界を浄化できそうです。悪霊退散!
But I love her design and her attacks. I usually have parts I like about both the global and the Japanese art, but for Miya, there's not really anything I prefer about Miya's global piece. In the global, she has a staff, which doesn't really make sense because she doesn't use a staff as her weapon. In the Japanese version, she holds 3 cards, and I didn't actually know this when I decided to move the arm, but the way she was introduced to and realized she liked gambling was because she played 3-card Monte until she was dragged home by a neighbor. And if you're like me and have never heard of this game, it's basically just like that one cup game where there's a coin under one of them and then the cups get shuffled and you have to guess where the coin is, but like with cards. And I know I decided to remove the cards, but I actually really like this homage to her backstory. I certainly like it better than the random staff they decided to give her in the other one. Like, if you want to give her something to hold, give her a fan, you know, her official weapon. I also tried to line the hair and pretty quickly realized the sketch is probably as good as it's gonna get. At first I was just gonna make the lines thinner with the eraser, but then I remembered that I'm using Clip Studio Paint, and there's a feature for that. If you go into Filter, Correction, and Adjust Line Width, you can decide whether you want your lines thinner or thicker and by how much. I actually kind of wish I had more opportunities to use it because it's so genius and it genuinely made my day when I realized I didn't have to do all of that work by hand. It gets kind of confused at intersections when you make the lines thinner, but it took me like 2 minutes to fix and actually made for some pretty decent line weight. Like a lot of other people, I recently joined Blue Sky, and there I discovered the artist Dat Cravat, who has now become a huge inspiration to me and has completely changed the way I do line art. Basically what they do is cell shade with pure black that gives this amazing contrast in all of their pieces, which is kind of what I tried to replicate in this drawing, although I'm not actually sure if it's part of their line art or the colors for them, but for me it's part of the line art. They also utilize a lot of texture in their piece with like manga style halftones and screen tones, which is not something I used in this piece, but I do want to try to include in my future drawing. I also really want to learn how to do backgrounds like her. There's always so much going on, and it adds so much to the vibe of the piece without distracting from the person in front. But sometimes it can be kind of hard to tell what exactly has been drawn, like in their Dan to Dan fan art. The background is incredible, but I'm not really sure what it's supposed to be, and that's genuinely not a bad thing. I think it's super impressive how the background can say so much about the characters and the scenery they're in when I don't even know what it's supposed to be. But maybe it's actually really clear to everyone who has seen the anime she's drawing. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's clear because when I read the alt text for the Dan to Dan fan art, I only ended up with more questions like who is Turbo Granny and why is she a cat? But yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how to make backgrounds like them. You'll even see later in the video I tried and failed to make a cool background for Miya. In my last piece of Yusei, another Guardian Tales character, I basically copied one of Dat Cravat's backgrounds, and it's genuinely one of my favorite parts of the drawing. And I will of course leave a link to their link tree in the description because they're pretty much on every platform you can think of, from TikTok to Facebook to DeviantArt. So please go follow them on whatever place you like best. I did still use like regular cell shading, but the black parts really add dimension to the whole piece. Although I'm still learning how and when to use it. Like, I'm super happy with how it looks on the runner of the Parasol, but I'm not loving how I did the hair. But I'm also just generally not great at drawing hair. Most times I either go overboard and it looks way more detailed than the rest of the drawing, or it ends up looking like I haven't done anything at all. But you know, I'm still learning, so maybe I'll get it right next time. So for the colors, I pretty much just color picked from the original art with a couple of adjustments, mostly to the skin color and to the white, because I prefer working with the non-white whites, which is one hell of a sentence. My goal is a teal color, but I'm also afraid of going too far and not having it read as white anymore. So I usually give in and just use a light version of the piece's primary color. But one day, I will overcome my fear and make my whites teal. I also kind of feel like I'm getting slower at drawing. Like just laying down the colors, which is like a pretty straightforward, simple, and quick thing to do, took me around 2 hours. And I know I've mentioned it earlier, but that's more than I spend on most of my finished pieces. And granted, this piece is more complicated than what I usually do, and I am experimenting with new methods, but I just don't feel like it's 10 hours more complicated. If I'm honest, I'm not sure I understand the physics of her sleeves, but she has this like hexagon pattern going on, and while Clip Studio does offer a hexagon pattern, I felt like it just made her look more techy and didn't really fit with her character, so I gave her some flowers instead. And this is one of the first times I really used these patterns built into Clip Studio, and I definitely didn't use it as optimally as I could have, but I quite like how it looks. It just gives some more visual interest to an otherwise blank piece of fabric. Oh yeah, and you might also have noticed she doesn't have a face most of the time, and that is completely intentional. If you watched my last video, you might know that I suck at drawing faces. It's something I really struggle with. I always end up staring at the face for so long that it looks weird no matter what I do. So in order to try and combat this, I made a new folder for just the face. Everything from the line art to the shading is in that folder, in order to be able to turn off the face whenever I wasn't actively working on it. And it was such a game changer. I didn't start overthinking if her face looks good while I was trying to work on something else. Every time I worked on the face, I was looking at it with brand new eyes, and I was able to easily spot and fix mistakes I might not have noticed otherwise. Like when I started coloring her face, I removed her lips because I realized they look really creepy. And when I did the rendering, I realized her bangs were way too short. I also made smaller adjustments that made a huge difference, like moving her irises and making her eyes bigger. And so many more we don't have time to go through, that I otherwise wouldn't have spotted if I hadn't removed her face whenever I wasn't actively working on it. So it might look a bit creepy, but unfortunately for you, this is the technique I'll be using from now on. Before I go in with the shadows and stuff, I like to add some dimension with an airbrush. So I start off by taking a darker version of the hair color and adding that to the tips of the hair and under her like bonnet, I guess. And then I lighten the underside of the hair, which is actually the opposite of what I'd normally do. I'd usually make it darker, but that's what they did in the original art, and I just followed that for some reason. And I actually used the same color that I used to lighten her hair to blush her skin. Everything gets a blush in, from her cheeks and shoulders to her fingertips and knuckles. And I'm just gonna skip over how I did her boobs because I don't really want to explain how they react differently to lights and shadows than most skin. But more importantly, I don't want to get into how and why I know that. Really irritatingly, I forgot to press record while I was doing the shading on the skin and sleeves because I actually had a lot to say about that. If you've dabbled even a little bit in digital art, you probably heard you should shade on a multiply layer. And while it is slightly limiting, I think it's generally a good rule of thumb and one that I use on occasion too. But when I started doing the shading for the skin, multiply just felt a bit too cool toned. So I played around with the blending modes, and color burn gave me exactly what I was looking for. I just picked up the base color and began shading, and it gave me that rich, vibrant color that also wasn't too dark like I usually find multiply is, so I didn't have to mess around with like the opacity or nothing. And I used a color burn layer for the rest of the drawing too, except for the skirt, the bell, and the hair. For the white parts, I changed the color I was using to shade to like a light pink, just because using the base color made it too yellow. Although I ran into one problem. It was that while a blending mode layer was inside a folder, the blending mode just wouldn't work. It wouldn't do anything. It behaved just like a normal layer. And it's a problem that I've run into before, but this time I was determined to solve it. And it turned out that the folders themselves also have blending modes. So you can, for example, set a whole folder to multiply, and every layer, regardless of their blending modes, will turn into a multiply layer, if that makes any sense. So the folders start off being set to normal, meaning that every layer in that folder is on normal, even if you set individual layers to something else. But if you set the folder to through, it stops having an effect on the layers inside of it. And so now I can have all of my flat colors and their shading all inside the same folder with no problems. And you probably also noticed that I changed the black parts of the sleeve to like a darker gray. And it's just because I felt like the black was a bit too harsh. And if I'm honest, I never really reach a point where I'm happy with how the sleeves look. I'm not really sure why or what I could have done instead. I don't like them. And yeah, when I started shading the ruffles, I had completely given up on my dream of understanding how ruffles work, so I just copied the original art very diligently. And now we arrive at my epic battle with my arch nemesis, the Parasol. For me, this took an hour. For you, it'll take about 2 minutes, so grab some popcorn and watch me descend into madness. So this process was a mix of hopes and dreams, copying from the original artwork, and substances I cannot name. At first I had hoped I could use the lines I had made during the sketching phase, but that would not be the case, and I wanted all the stretchers to be outlined without having to outline them myself. And I'm pretty sure there's a better way of doing this, but the way I did it was duplicating the layer and making the lower layer black and then making the width of the lower layer bigger with the adjust line width tool. And then I realized that the center isn't centered, so I had to move all the stretchers and the top knot slightly to the left, which my computer was not happy about. And then I had to make some of the lines longer again, which I did with the liquify tool. And if you don't know, the liquify tool is not great at keeping things straight. And it also can't move multiple layers at once as far as I'm aware. And because I also had the outline layer, that meant I had to do it twice. Someone sedate me. Also, yes, I'm aware this is not the most efficient way of doing it. Don't lecture me. And then once again, the hopes I had of being able to skip a step and just use the sketch layer was squashed, as I realized not only are the lines incredibly wobbly, none of them even line up. So I had to redraw all of them, which is harder than it looks, alright? And I think insanity had finally taken over at this point because I redrew the same lines over and over. Dude, they look exactly the same. But once I was finally happy with it, I did the same outline trick as earlier before adding the ultimate highlight, which is always the highlight of my day, until I had to do the highlight or whatever that is on the umbrella, and I lost my mind again. And then it was time to add the cute little flowers she has on her umbrella, which was also kind of a struggle, but I think because of the madness I just went through, it was such a breath of fresh air that in my mind, it was one of the most enjoyable parts of the whole 12-hour process. I found the flowers I wanted on my second try, and through a little bit of color adjustments and some movie magic, I got what I wanted. And throughout all the struggle, I actually learned something new about myself. And it's that I don't think I know how umbrellas work. I pushed off making the skirts because I didn't know how to do it, and I kind of hoped that I had magically learned how to do ruffles and that I would freehand them. And I did try, it just didn't go very well. But in the end, the shading on the skirt is actually one of my favorite parts of the drawing. And I'm just gonna skip straight to the background because I really don't think you need to watch me struggle to draw ruffles for, what, the 5th time? For the background, I added a drop shadow of Miya's silhouette, which has quickly become one of my favorite things to do for a background. Other than that, I just added some screen tone blobs. I did try out some other things, but none of them really looked right. So the background ends up looking kind of boring, but I think that's still better than having it be too much. And with that, I think the drawing's done. So do you guys remember when I was talking about how I didn't like the sleeves and I couldn't figure out why? Well, I figured out why. While I was writing part of the script, I looked up a picture of Miya, and while I was trying to figure out how the hell her sleeves are put together, I saw it. 2 yellow stripes that had completely slipped my mind. And not only that, in my haste to rectify my mistake, I forgot to press record. So what you're seeing now is my second time drawing these hellish stripes, but I'm happy to announce that that was in fact what was missing, and now I like the sleeves. But that's really all I wanted to talk about for today. I really love this drawing so much. I'm so happy I've remembered the stripes. I just feel like it really brings the whole piece together. Like before, I just kept going back to it and wanting to fix something. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. But now I finally found what was bugging me and I can rest easy. Which sounds dramatic, but also is dramatic. Okay, bye.